Hello, I'm John Arnold and this is photowalkthrough.com, Tutorial 5, Chapter 1. This week we're looking at an unusual image that was constructed using the Photoshop High Dynamic Range or HDR tool. But before we begin, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all the kind people who voted for the show on Podcast Alley in April. They run a top 50 list of the most popular shows there, and we finished the month in 6th place on the video podcast charts. That's just amazing. We were right there behind Tiki Bar TV, and that's one of the best known video podcasts in the world. Well, it's a new month starting today, and they reset the figures every month, so please consider voting for us again. I do see subscribers coming in from Podcast Alley, and remember that you can vote for more than one show on Podcast Alley. You can vote for all your favourites. And as always, you can vote for us on the photowalkthrough.com homepage. There's a voting form on the right-hand side of the page if you scroll down a little. Also coming up very soon, I'm going to run the first of our photowalkthrough.com specials. Those shows will air on Thursdays and won't interfere with the regular Monday shows. I've already mentioned that there's a viewer images critique show coming up, and I'm still working on that. But the first special will be a PaintShop Pro conversion tutorial. My good friend Matt has done some PSP PaintShop Pro videos showing how some of the techniques that we've covered here can be applied in PaintShop Pro. So please tell your PaintShop Pro using friends about the show, let them know the special's coming up, and hopefully that will help some PaintShop Pro users get something useful out of these shows as well. So let's get started. As usual, the source images for this picture are available on the photowalkthrough.com website. Each tutorial I'd cover has got its own page on the site, so if you go to the website and click video tutorials, you can see all of the various video tutorial images we've covered, and each one has got the downloadable files so that you can try them, follow along yourself in Photoshop. But once again, we're dealing with an image that's created out of multiple raw files, so instead of providing you one huge zip file containing all the raw files, which would just be too large, I've converted them to JPEGs for you, and I've provided a zip file that contains all the converted JPEGs. So let's take a look at the shot. You can see it here on the screen. It's taken in Belper in Derbyshire. I was born in Derby and spent many of my childhood years in and around Derbyshire. And I've set myself a project of shooting the places around me and the places where I've lived, particularly landscapes and local culture. I'm interested in what makes a place the way it is, sort of local industry and local heritage, local landscape. This shot in particular is part of a collection of images of Belper that I took when I was on a very short break there recently. You can see the other Belper images in the collection on my Flickr account, and I will include a link to that in the show notes. This particular image is of a tree that stands in the middle of a horseshoe-shaped weir that sits in the river alongside the huge East Mill. It's probably one of the most recognisable sites in Belper. And what I was trying to do here was, I had fairly ambitious goals, because it was a water shot, and I rather like the long exposure milky water effects that you get if you do a long exposure with water. But I wanted to do it at night, so I was fairly ambitious just to start with there. I wanted to do a long nighttime water exposure, so I got the sort of milky nighttime effect. But when I got there and started taking the photos, I realised that I was getting areas of the image were overexposed and other areas were underexposed. Just to start pointing at the image here, this area where the water is landing off the weir into the splashing in the water down here was overexposed, and the reason for that was that there was a large tungsten light just out of shot here on the right hand side, which is the main light source for the whole image. And it was brightly lighting this area here, and we were just getting a bit of light on the tree, a little bit of light down the side here, but nowhere near as much. It was way bright here and very, very dark in all the other parts of the image. So just trying to shoot it, I found that I was getting some images that I simply couldn't use. I was getting underexposure and overexposure all in the same shot. So I decided the solution was probably to do an HDR, High Dynamic Range composite, using the Photoshop feature that I think came in CS2. What that does is it takes a number of exposures and puts them together so that you can use the the best bits of each image, and in particular what it's designed to do is take scenes like this where you've got very light and very dark areas and merge them together so that you can see detail in all those areas. So I'll just try and explain briefly what dynamic range is. In the simplest terms, it's the range of brightness values. If you look at if you look out of your window, the sky will tend to be brighter than the ground, but your eyes make it so that you can see both. Our eyes are extremely good at dealing with very large variances in brightness values. So the sky, which might be, particularly if it's cloudy, the sky will be an awful lot brighter than the ground. And you've probably seen in photos you've taken that sometimes your camera will expose for the sky, and the sky will come out looking very bright, and the ground will come out very dark and muddy, and you won't have much detail, and it'll all look very shadowy. This is a major difference between what the cameras can cope with and what our eyes can cope with. Our eyes, as I say, are very good at taking very large brightness values and adjusting very quickly. If we go from a light room to a dark room, you might notice that your eyes take a moment to adjust. But when it comes to looking at brightly lit scenes, your eyes can take in the darker areas by adjusting their reaction very quickly, and so skies and grounds tend to look similar brightness to our eyes, but to a camera they won't. So dynamic range is simply about capturing the light and the dark areas both with good detail and both nicely lit. And because a camera can't cope with as much as our eyes can, what we have to do instead is take a number of different scenes, a number of different exposures of the same scene, all with different exposure values. So just to look at this image in particular, this area here with the very bright water splashing, I'm taking an exposure that exposed that nicely, and then these branches here which have got less light on them, I've taken another separate exposure that exposes those correctly. So let me take you to the actual source images, and we'll quickly just look through the images I took. I've got this zoomed up here so that you can see the images nicely in the bridge. This image here, as you can see, is one of the brighter ones, and you can see overexposure here in the water already. But you can see there's reasonably good detail in the branches of the trees here. In this little island bit here, we can see a little bit of detail in the rocks, and a little bit of detail in the background that actually I'm probably going to blow away when we work on the image later. But as I just scroll down, I'm just going to press down on my keyboard so I'm selecting the next image down and down and down, and you can see the image getting darker as I go. And even there in the middle, look, this is a 1 second exposure at f2.8. And remember, I was intentionally keeping these exposure times long. I wanted long shutter speeds so that I got this water looking sort of I didn't want to see individual droplets, I wanted to see sort of big milky clouds of water. So as I go down, this one's about halfway down now, you can see that we've got overexposure here in the water still, and we've got bad underexposure all around the top here. So that demonstrates the problem I was having quite well. As I carry on down, my shutter speed is getting shorter and shorter. That's a seventh, that's a fifth, that's a third of a second, that's a quarter of a second, that's a sixth of a second, and that's the last one I took. And you can at that point start to see the detail in the water here. It's nicely exposed, but almost nothing else in the entire rest of the picture. So let me just go back up through those, and you can see what I'm going to merge here. And you'll also see one of the other things that's very important here. Because the merge to HDR feature is going to take all of these images and drop them all on top of each other, and what it's going to do is any areas that are underexposed in an image, in any of the images, it will throw away, and any areas that are overexposed in any of the images, it will throw away. So what it will end up with is the best bits of all the images together, and it will build a big 32-bit image, I think, in memory. So loads and loads of available brightness values in a 32-bit image file. We're normally working in 8-bit per channel. I think this is working 32-bit per channel. So it will build up an image with all those values available in it, and then it will allow us to compress down so that we end up with an 8-bit per channel image like we would normally use. A little bit technical, but you'll see it when I do it in just a moment. Now, because it's going to drop these all on top of each other, they've got to be lined up. So very important when you're shooting HDR scenes. The shots must line up exactly on top of each other, so you need to keep the camera still. Use a tripod if you can, that would be the best way to do it. In this case, this weir is overlooked by a bridge, and all I had with me was a beanbag, so I put my camera on the beanbag. Incidentally, that's a great tip, and it's one that Chris on Tips from the Top Floor mentions an awful lot. Use a beanbag if you don't want to carry a bulky tripod with you. A beanbag is a really good alternative. You get a decent sized beanbag, it's all squishy, you can put it down on top of a rock or on the top of a post or on the ground, put your camera on it, look through the viewfinder, line it all up, squidge the beanbag around until the camera's pointing in the direction you want, and then either use the self timer if you want to not be touching the camera when you press the shutter button, or if you've got a remote shutter release, use that. And that's a great way to get the sort of steadiness that you would get off a tripod without having to carry all that bulky equipment around with you. So in this case I had a beanbag resting on the railing of the bridge, and I just did my level best. I do have a remote shutter release, so I just did my level best to keep the camera really still. I used the shutter release to fire the camera off, and I just stayed very still and didn't breathe whilst if you look at this top image here, that's a 6-second exposure at f2.8. That's a really long exposure. Now, just to demonstrate the point about the images needing to register perfectly, if you look between here and here, I'm just switching back and forth between these top two images. You can see the trees moving a little. My camera moved just a tiny bit between taking those two images. So if I carry on down, you'll see that all the others, if you watch the top of this rock here, you can see it most clearly there. Watch the top of that rock. It's not moving between any of the other images. It's just that very top image. If you watch the top of the rock now, it moves down a bit. So I can't use that first image. If I do, what will happen is that the parts of this image that are usable, so these areas that are nicely exposed over here, it will take parts of that image there and parts of that image there, and you'll end up with slight double exposure. You get a little light double image that will appear. So you don't want to do that. Use images only if they register nicely. I've taken probably more here than actually were needed. But that helps because if you look at the other parts of the image, this bit here for example, there's just a little bit of flotsam that's under that branch of the tree there, and in each shot I'll move the mouse out of the way, in each shot it moves quite a bit, and in the final image we end up with this sort of milky looking just sort of pool of, it's not even clear that it's flotsam, it just looks like sort of misty water. So the more shots you take, the more these images will combine together to give you that kind of, in this case, what I wanted, which is the milky water, the sort of slight blurry. I didn't want water droplets. I didn't want too much detail in the water. I just wanted it to look sort of smooth. So, and the same is true of the water on this waterfall here. The pattern of the water falling changes a little as it goes. So. Right, and when you're taking these shots, the other thing to be aware of, obviously any movement in the scene is bad, so be aware of trees blowing in the wind or clouds moving in the wind. They can sometimes mess your HDR shots up, sometimes they can look really great. The other thing to be aware of is to vary the shutter speed, not the f-stop. If you want to take lots of these shots so that they all match each other, you probably want the depth of field to match as well. So what you want to vary, you want to set your f-stop to whatever depth of field you want for this particular image, and then vary the shutter speed so that you're getting lots of different exposures with the same sort of depth of field. It also ought to be possible, I haven't actually tried this, but it occurred to me while I was preparing for the show, you could theoretically vary the ISO as well. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work. I haven't tried it. I'd love to know if somebody else has tried varying the ISO and the shutter speed to see whether or not that gives any better results. And as I say, discard any images where the camera moved in between. So I'm going to now just quickly race through exporting these as JPEGs from RAW. You've seen me do this before. All I've done there, I'm just clicking the first image, scrolling down to the last image, and shift-clicking the last image. And then I'm going to either right-click, this is probably out of shot for you, right-click and choose Opening Camera RAW, or keyboard shortcut of the week, hit Control-R in the bridge to take those into the RAW converter. Now, I've showed you this before, and unfortunately this raw converter is just too big for an 800 by 600 window. But here we go. This is the raw converter window. You can see I've got all the images down the left hand side here, and remember we've got that top one that doesn't quite register. It moves a little between the top and first and second images, so I won't worry too much about that first image where it's not lined up properly. But on the rest, I'm just keeping the settings really simple. I'm not dialing in any exposure compensation. I was careful to get, when I took these shots, I was careful to get a good exposure at the start of the series and at the end, so that the start of the series had got detail in the very darkest areas, and the end of the series had got good detail in the very brightest areas. And so I'm not going to mess with that. I'm just going to use the same settings for all of the images in this series. So no exposure compensation, no shadows compensation. I kept the brightness right in the middle, I kept the contrast to 0. I've just made everything very straightforward. All I did was correct the white balance, because as I shot it, as you can see, I got the white balance very wrong when I shot it, and I've corrected that in here just by choosing tungsten, because it was a tungsten light that was lighting the scene. So racing on, I'm just going to press, once I've set all of that, remember you can set those exposure settings over here. You can do select all and synchronize, and that will apply those settings to all the other images in the scene, in the dialogue. And then I'm just going to press done in the bottom corner. And then once you've got all those selected and you've got your, remember this little icon here means that you've got some camera raw settings applied to this image. If you go to Tools, Photoshop, Image Processor, this will fire up Photoshop, and it will give us this image processor window here, which I think I've mentioned before, but I'll run through it very quickly again. We've got quite a lot of new listeners, so sorry for the repetition. The image processor is an extremely useful way of quickly converting a lot of JPEG files, RAW files into JPEG, or converting a lot of JPEG files for saving to the web. All sorts of automated image conversion processes. Because I called this from Bridge, it knows straight off that the images I had selected in the bridge are the ones I want to work with. So you see here it says process files from the bridge only, and it's telling me I've got 11 selected, which is great. That's fine. If I had only done a RAW conversion on the first one, I could use the RAW settings on that first one to apply to all the other images. In this case, I've applied the RAW settings to all of them, so I don't need to do that. Where I want to save the files, in the same location. It lies ever so slightly. What it actually does is it creates a folder. If you're saving as JPEG, it creates a folder called JPEG. If you're saving as PSD, it creates a folder called PSD, and likewise for TIFF. So when it says in the same location, it means in a subdirectory of the current location. So carrying on down, what I want here is JPEGs. I'm just going to use a very high quality setting. I think the maximum is 12. I go for 11. And I do not want to convert to sRGB in this case. I want to keep with the Adobe RGB, because I don't convert to sRGB until the very end of the process. I don't want to resize them. I want to leave them at the full size. I work as much as possible in the largest possible size, and then I shrink them down to right at the end of the process. I sharpen and shrink and convert to sRGB just for exporting to the web. Otherwise, I keep everything in Adobe, and I keep everything as large as possible. Adobe RGB, I mean the color profile. I don't need PSDs at this stage. I don't need TIFFs at this stage. I don't want to run an action on it. I do want to attach my copyright information to it, and I do want to include the ICC profile. That's the color profile. So if I press run on that, I'm not going to do it because I don't want to keep you waiting, but if I pressed run on that, what it would do is it would run through all those images that we've got selected in the bridge there, and it would create this folder, the JPEG folder. And this is what you'll find in the zip file, the downloadable zip file on the website. These are the exported images from the RAW, and out there come as JPEGs. So just before we finish up the show here, I'm actually going to get round to doing the HDR. I've done a lot of talking so far. I'm going to select all those images, click the first one, shift click the last one. Remember, the first one is not right, so I can control click on the first one to turn that off. That first one was the one where the camera moved slightly, so we've got all but the first one selected. And if I go to Tools, Photoshop, merge to HDR, with all those 10 images selected, merge to HDR, and that will open those images now in Photoshop. and you can see it's just running through and opening them all one at a time. This just takes a moment or two, and when it's done that, it now says computing response curves. What it's doing is it's looking at the information in each file, seeing what the shutter speed was, what the aperture was, what the ISO was, figuring out what the brightness value of all those light and dark points on each picture are, and then it's saying, right, which bits of these pictures are well exposed. Okay, we've got another dialogue that's way too big. It's saying which bits of these pictures are well exposed, which bits do I want to use from each image. This looks an awful lot like the raw conversion window. We've got down the left hand side, we've got all the images that we selected. So we've got the very brightest one up there, we've got the very darkest one down there, and we can, if we wish, turn on and off each of these and have it use or not use certain of these images. It takes a moment for it just to recompute the way the image should look, and you can see we've got a preview here of how that final image looks. Let me turn that back on again. And you can see this looks pretty bright here. It doesn't look like it's going to be great right away, but trust me on this, it'll get better. You can see here on the right hand side, it's offering us a couple of different bit depths to export this file in. It works, I believe, in 32 bits per channel initially, and it's basically taking all the right bits of all these images, composing them together into one huge file with 32 bits per channel, and we actually want to export it as an 8-bit per channel image. So I'm going to choose 8 bits per channel there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a bit of the image to look at that's got, let's zoom out a little bit actually, that's got some dark bits in and some light bits in, and this slider here tells us where the white point should be, and what I'm going to try and do is just get it so that the image looks as right as I can, as even as I can. So I would say about there. We've got some detail here. It is still very blown out here, but the next step of this process, if I now press OK, and this takes a moment as well, it's creating the HDR file. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to ask us how we want to handle the parts of the image that are under and overexposed, and there are a number of different options in here, and just for once I'm going to tell you to take the easy one. Normally I mess with things an awful lot and I'm very fussy about the way these things are done, but in this case the HDR works best. Here's the HDR conversion window that's just popped up. It comes up by default with an exposure and gamma slider, and you can, let me just drag these around a little bit and show you, you can change the exposure values yourself, and as I drag this exposure slider you can see we're getting more or less detail in here, and then I could also, let me try to find a place where you can see the image. I can also drag the gamma up and down to make it overall brighter or darker. I could work that way, and that would not be a bad way to leave it. You can see I'm brightening the overall image, and I've got the exposure set so that I've got some detail in here, which is where I was getting overexposure. Or you could forget about that, and you could just choose highlight compression, which is the simple one, and that will do a pretty damn good job. As you can see, I actually prefer this version. There's not quite so much detail in here, but the lovely thing about this version is that we've got good detail overall, and it's actually made this a sort of a big milky, I wanted that creamy look on the water. I didn't want too much detail in the water, and this just gives me a well exposed image with exactly that kind of level of detail in it. So in this case I'm going to choose highlight compression. There are a couple of other methods in here. Equalize histogram almost never produces a good version. Local adaptation, no idea what that's trying to do, but it never looks good to me, so I go with highlight compression, and I'm just going to press OK on that. And that will be our final image for this week. Next week I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you the other steps to processing this image. We're going to crop it a bit for composition, lighten it a bit, add some dodging and burning, and we're going to add a gradient, a color gradient to the image as well, just to give it all of the Belper images I've got a consistent look to them. So I'll show you how I did that. Thank you very much for listening this week. I will catch you next week. All the best.